The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone streets of the small French village of Saint-Emilion. It was the summer of 1944, and the air was thick with tension that had been building for months. Liberation was coming. Everyone could feel it, but with it came a dangerous time when old scores would be settled and justice would be served in the streets. Marie Dubois walked carefully down the narrow pathway that led from her small cottage to the village center. At 23, she had learned to move quietly, to avoid drawing attention to herself. Her dark hair was pinned back neatly under a simple headscarf, and she carried a small basket that she hoped to fill with whatever food she could find or trade for. These days, finding enough to eat was a constant struggle for everyone in the village. The war had changed everything. What used to be a peaceful farming community where everyone knew their neighbors had become a place where people watched each other with suspicious eyes. Trust had become a luxury that few could afford. Marie knew this better than most. For the past 2 years, she had been living under a cloud of whispered accusations and cold stares from people who had once been her friends. The trouble had started when Captain Heinrich Müller arrived in Saint-Emilion with his unit of German soldiers in 1942. They had taken over the mayor's house and set up their headquarters there. Like in every occupied village, the people had to learn to live with the presence of their unwelcome guests. Some resisted quietly, some collaborated openly, and most tried to simply survive without taking sides. Marie had been working at the village bakery when the Germans arrived. Old Pierre Moreau, who owned the bakery, was too sick to work much anymore, and Marie had become essential to keeping the business running. The Germans needed bread just like everyone else, and soon they became regular customers. This was where Marie's troubles began. Captain Müller was a man in his early 30s, tall and serious, with light blue eyes that seemed to see everything. Unlike some of the other German officers who acted with cruelty and arrogance, Müller was polite and respectful. He spoke decent French and always said please and thank you when he bought bread. He never took anything without paying, and he treated Marie with the same courtesy he would show any shopkeeper. At first, their interactions were purely business. Müller would come in, order bread for his men, pay for it, and leave. But as the weeks passed, he began to linger a little longer, making small talk about the weather or commenting on how good the bread smelled. Marie was cautious but polite in return. She had learned that being rude to German officers could bring terrible consequences not just for herself, but for everyone in the village. The other villagers began to notice these conversations. At first, they were just curious glances and raised eyebrows. But as the interactions continued, the whispers started. Some people began to suggest that Marie was being too friendly with the enemy. Others wondered if there was something more than just business happening between the young French woman and the German captain. The truth was more complicated than the gossips could imagine. Marie did find herself looking forward to Müller's visits, not because she supported the German cause, but because he was one of the few people who still treated her like a human being. In a time when everyone was suspicious of everyone else, his simple kindness stood out. He never made inappropriate advances or used his position to pressure her. He simply talked to her like she was a person worth talking to. As the months passed, their conversations grew longer and more personal. Müller told her about his home in Bavaria, about the mountains and forests he missed. He spoke about his mother, who ran a small inn, and how he worried about her safety as the war dragged on. Marie found herself sharing stories about her life before the war, about her dreams of maybe traveling someday, about the books she loved to read. These conversations were dangerous, and Marie knew it. But they were also a lifeline in a world that had become increasingly dark and fearful. Müller never asked her for information about the resistance activities in the village, and she never offered any. They created a small bubble of humanity in the middle of a war that seemed designed to destroy such connections. But the villagers saw what they expected to see. When Marie smiled at something Müller said, they saw collaboration. When he brought her a small gift of coffee or sugar, They saw payment for favors. When they spoke quietly together, they saw conspiracy. The truth that they were simply two lonely people finding comfort in conversation was too simple and too human for a time when everything was viewed through the lens of war and betrayal. The situation became worse when Marie's younger brother Jacques joined the local resistance group. At 19, Jacques was full of anger and righteous fury about the occupation. He couldn't understand how his sister could be civil to the enemy, let alone seem to enjoy their company. The arguments between the siblings became heated and painful. "How can you smile at them?" Jacques demanded one evening after he had seen Marie talking with Mueller outside the bakery. "They are the enemy. They killed Papa's brother. They took away our freedom." Marie tried to explain that being polite was not the same as being a traitor, that sometimes survival required difficult choices. But Jacques was young and saw everything in black and white. To him, you were either fighting the Germans or helping them, and his sister's behavior looked far too much like the latter. The resistance members began to view Marie with suspicion as well. They worried that she might overhear something and pass it along to Mueller. They started excluding Jacques from certain operations because they didn't trust his sister. This put Jacques in an impossible position, torn between his loyalty to the resistance and his love for his sister. Meanwhile, the war was changing. By early 1944, everyone could sense that the German position was becoming desperate. There were rumors of Allied landings, of German retreats on other fronts. The occupying soldiers became more nervous and more harsh in their treatment of the local population. But Mueller remained the same polite, respectful man he had always been. One day, in late spring, Mueller came to the bakery looking troubled. He bought his usual order, but seemed reluctant to leave. Finally, he spoke quietly to Marie. "Things are going to change soon," he said. "There will be fighting here. You should be careful." It was the closest he had ever come to giving her military information, and Marie understood that he was trying to warn her without betraying his duties. She thanked him quietly, and he left. It was the last normal conversation they would have. Within weeks, the liberation began. Allied forces landed in Normandy, and the German forces in the region began preparing for withdrawal. The villagers could feel the excitement building. Freedom was coming at last. But with liberation came a terrible reckoning. As the Germans prepared to leave, some villagers began making lists of those who had collaborated with the enemy. Marie's name was near the top of every list. The friendly conversations, the polite interactions, the coffee and sugar that Mueller had given her, all of it was now seen as evidence of treason. Jacques tried desperately to defend his sister, but his own position with the resistance was compromised by his association with her. The resistance leaders told him that Marie would have to face justice like any other collaborator. The fact that she had never actually passed along information or aided the German war effort didn't matter to the angry villagers who had suffered under occupation for 2 long years. The day finally came when American and French forces entered Saint-Emilion. The German soldiers, including Mueller, had withdrawn during the night without fighting. The villagers poured into the streets, cheering and crying with joy. French flags appeared in windows, and people embraced each other in celebration. But the celebration quickly turned dark. Within hours of the liberation, the settling of scores began. People who had collaborated with the Germans were dragged from their homes. Some were beaten, some were arrested, and some faced the traditional punishment for collaboration, public humiliation. Marie had hoped that she might escape notice in the chaos of liberation. She stayed in her cottage, hoping that people would be too focused on celebrating to remember their anger toward her. But she was not so fortunate. On the second day after liberation, a group of villagers appeared at her door. Among them were people she had known since childhood, people whose children she had played with, people who had once been friends. But their faces were hard and unforgiving now. "Marie Dubois," said Henri Leclerc, who had become one of the leaders of the local resistance. "You are accused of horizontal collaboration with the enemy. You will come with us to face judgment." Horizontal collaboration was the term used for French women who had romantic or sexual relationships with German soldiers. It was considered one of the worst forms of betrayal, and the punishment was severe and public. Marie tried to protest that she had never had such a relationship with Mueller or any German soldier, but no one was interested in hearing her explanation. They dragged her to the village square, where a crowd had already gathered. Someone had set up a wooden chair in the center of the square. Marie's heart sank as she realized what was about to happen. She had heard about these punishments in other villages. Accused collaborators had their heads shaved in public as a mark of shame. The crowd was excited and angry. These were people who had suffered under occupation, who had lost family members to the war, who had endured hunger and fear and helplessness for years. Now, they finally had someone to blame, someone to punish. The fact that Marie had never actually harmed them didn't matter. She had been friendly with the enemy, and that was enough. They pushed her down into the chair, and someone produced a pair of large scissors. Marie's beautiful dark hair, which she had always taken pride in, was about to become the symbol of her supposed shame. She looked around desperately, hoping to see a friendly face, someone who would speak up for her. But everyone she had once considered a friend was either absent or looking away. Her brother Jacques stood at the edge of the crowd, his face torn with anguish. He wanted to help her, but he knew that defending her now would only make him a target as well. The resistance had already questioned his loyalty because of his sister's behavior. If he tried to stop this punishment, he would likely face the same fate. As the scissors approached her hair, Marie closed her eyes and tried to prepare herself for the humiliation that was coming. She thought about the conversations with Mueller, wondering if those brief moments of human kindness had been worth this price. She thought about her parents, who had died before the war, and was grateful they couldn't see what their daughter was enduring. The first cut was made, and a long lock of her dark hair fell to the ground. The crowd cheered. Someone spat at her. Another person called her a traitor and a whore. Marie kept her eyes closed and tried to disappear inside herself, to go somewhere in her mind where the hatred and anger couldn't reach her. But then something unexpected happened. The sound of a military vehicle approaching cut through the noise of the crowd. Everyone turned to look as a jeep with American markings pulled into the square. Several soldiers got out, led by an officer with the stars of a general on his uniform. General William Thompson had been touring the newly liberated villages, assessing the situation and ensuring that the transition from occupation to freedom was proceeding smoothly. He was a career military man who had seen too much of war to have any illusions about its effects on people. He understood that liberation often brought out both the best and worst in human nature. As he surveyed the scene in the village square, Thompson immediately understood what was happening. He had seen similar scenes in other liberated towns. The desire for revenge was natural, but it often targeted the weakest rather than the most guilty. In his experience, the women accused of collaboration were usually guilty of nothing more than trying to survive in impossible circumstances. Thompson approached the crowd with his translator, a young French-American lieutenant named Robert Cohn. The general's presence immediately changed the atmosphere in the square. These villagers had been celebrating American liberation just hours before, and now here was a real American general among them. "What's happening here?" Thompson asked through his translator. Henri Leclerc stepped forward, eager to explain to the liberating forces why this punishment was necessary. "This woman collaborated with the Germans," he said proudly. "She was friendly with their officers. We're giving her the justice she deserves." Thompson looked at Marie, sitting in the chair with tears streaming down her face and her partially cut hair falling around her shoulders. He saw a young woman who looked terrified and ashamed, but not dangerous. He had learned to read people quickly and accurately, and everything about this situation seemed wrong to him. "What specific crimes did she commit?" Thompson asked. The question seemed to confuse Leclerc. She talked with them. She was friendly. The German captain came to the bakery where she worked, and they talked together like friends. Did she pass military information to the Germans? Well, no, but did she help them find resistance fighters? Not exactly, but did she have a romantic relationship with any German soldiers? Leclerc hesitated. She was seen talking with the captain many times. They seemed close. Thompson looked around at the crowd, seeing the eager, angry faces of people who wanted someone to blame for their suffering. He understood their anger, but he also understood justice. And what he was seeing here was not justice. The general was a man who believed deeply in fairness and the rule of law. He had not spent years fighting to defeat tyranny only to watch it be replaced by mob rule. The sight of this young woman being publicly humiliated based on accusations rather than evidence stirred something deep in his sense of right and wrong. "Stop this immediately," Thompson said firmly through his translator. "This woman will not be harmed further until there is a proper investigation of any actual crime she may have committed." The crowd began to murmur unhappily. They had been looking forward to completing Marie's punishment. Some people began to protest that this was a French matter and that the Americans should not interfere with French justice. But Thompson was not intimidated by their complaints. He had seen too many innocent people suffer because of war hysteria and mob mentality. He was not about to let it happen on his watch, especially not when the United States had just spent enormous resources to liberate these people from tyranny. "This is now under American military authority," he announced. "Anyone who continues to threaten this woman will be arrested and tried by military tribunal." The threat was clear and effective. Whatever anger the villagers felt toward Marie, they were not willing to risk imprisonment by the very forces that had just liberated them. Slowly, reluctantly, the crowd began to disperse. Thompson approached Marie, who was still sitting in the chair, trembling with shock and relief. The general was not a particularly emotional man, but the sight of her obvious fear and gratitude moved him. He could see that she was very young and that she had been truly terrified of what was about to happen to her. "You're safe now," he said gently through his translator. "No one is going to hurt you." Marie looked up at him with eyes full of tears and disbelief. After months of hatred and suspicion from her own people, this foreign soldier had stepped in to protect her when no one else would. She tried to speak, but found that her voice wouldn't work. Thompson turned to his men. "Set up a temporary headquarters in this village. I want to interview everyone involved in this situation and get to the bottom of what actually happened here." As the American soldiers began organizing their temporary command post, Thompson took one more look at Marie. She was still sitting in the chair, touching her partially cut hair with shaking hands. The general realized that this young woman's ordeal was far from over. Even if he could protect her from immediate harm, she would still have to live in this village with people who considered her a traitor. But for now, at least she was safe. And sometimes in the chaos of war and liberation, that was the most anyone could hope for. The general walked away to begin his investigation, unaware that his intervention would change not just Marie's immediate fate, but the entire trajectory of her life. The young woman sitting in that chair, with her half-shorn hair and tear-stained face, would never forget the moment when a stranger stepped in to defend her when her own people had abandoned her. And though she didn't know it yet, this was only the beginning of her story. General Thompson established his temporary headquarters in the village hall, a modest stone building that had served as the heart of St. Emilien's local government for over a century. The American flag hanging outside was a powerful symbol of the new order, and villagers gathered in small groups throughout the day, whispering about what the general's investigation might mean for their community. Marie had been taken to a small room above the bakery where she worked, under the protection of 2 American soldiers who stood guard outside. Lieutenant Cohn had arranged for the village doctor, an elderly man named Dr. Rousseau, to examine her and tend to her partially cut hair. The doctor was one of the few villagers who had remained neutral during the accusations against Marie, and he treated her with professional kindness. "The important thing now is that you're safe," Dr. Rousseau said as he carefully trimmed her hair to make it even. "General Thompson is a good man. He won't let them hurt you anymore." Marie nodded, but remained largely silent. The shock of what had almost happened to her was still too fresh. She kept touching her shortened hair, mourning the loss of something that had been part of her identity for so long. But more than that, she was struggling to process the reality that her own neighbors, people she had known her entire life, had been ready to humiliate and possibly harm her based on nothing more than rumors and suspicion. Meanwhile, General Thompson was conducting interviews with various villagers, trying to piece together the true story of what had happened between Marie and Captain Mueller. His years of military experience had taught him to separate emotion from fact, and he approached each conversation with careful attention to detail. Henri Leclerc was the first to be questioned. The resistance leader sat stiffly across from Thompson, clearly uncomfortable with having his actions questioned by the very forces he had hoped to impress with his patriotic zeal. "Tell me exactly what you observed between Mademoiselle Dubois and the German captain," Thompson said through Lieutenant Cohn. "They talked together almost every day when he came to buy bread," Leclerc replied. "Sometimes for many minutes. She would smile and laugh with him. He brought her gifts, coffee, and sugar that ordinary people couldn't get. It was obvious they had a special relationship. Did you ever see any physical contact between them? Holding hands, embracing, anything of that nature?" Leclerc shifted uncomfortably. "Well, no, not exactly. But they were always talking very closely together, like they were sharing secrets." "Did you ever hear what they talked about?" "No, but did you ever see her pass him any papers or information?" "No, but she could have been doing it when no one was watching." Thompson made notes as he listened. What he was hearing was a pattern he had seen in many liberated towns. Suspicion based on appearance rather than evidence, rumors that grew into accepted facts, and the dangerous tendency of communities to turn on their most vulnerable members when looking for someone to blame for their suffering. The next interview was with Marie's brother Jacques. The young man was clearly tormented by what had happened to his sister, but also frustrated by what he saw as her poor judgment during the occupation. "I tried to warn her," Jacques said, his voice filled with pain. "I told her that people were talking, that she needed to be more careful. But she wouldn't listen. She said she was just being polite, that it was her job to serve customers at the bakery." "Do you believe your sister passed information to the Germans?" Thompson asked. Jacques was quiet for a long moment. "No," he finally admitted. "Marie would never do anything to hurt French people. She's not political at all. She doesn't always think about how things look to other people." "Do you believe she had a romantic relationship with Captain Mueller?" Again, Jacques hesitated. "I don't know. Maybe she had feelings for him. But Marie has always been friendly with everyone. Before the war, she was the kind of person who would talk to strangers in a market, who remembered everyone's birthdays. That's just who she is." Thompson found this description interesting. It painted a picture of a young woman whose natural kindness and social nature had been misinterpreted in the paranoid atmosphere of occupation and resistance. He also interviewed several other villagers, including some who had been customers at the bakery. Most admitted that they had never seen anything truly inappropriate between Marie and Captain Mueller, but they insisted that her behavior had been suspicious nonetheless. The pattern became clear. Marie had been judged not for what she had done, but for what people thought she might have done. The most revealing interview came from Madame Beaumont, an elderly woman who lived near the bakery and had often observed the interactions between Marie and the German captain. Unlike the others, she seemed genuinely concerned about truth rather than revenge. "Marie is a good girl," Madame Beaumont said firmly. "Yes, she talked with the German officer, but she talked with everyone. That's her nature. I watched those conversations from my window, and I never saw anything improper. He was always respectful, and she was always polite but careful." "What do you think the others saw that made them so suspicious?" Thompson asked. "Fear," the old woman replied without hesitation. "People were afraid, and when people are afraid, they see danger everywhere, even where it doesn't exist. Marie was an easy target because she was kind to someone they thought she should hate. But kindness isn't collaboration, General. Sometimes it's just kindness." After completing his initial interviews, Thompson requested to speak with Marie herself. She was brought to the village hall under escort, still wearing the simple dress she had put on that morning when she thought she was just going to the market. Her newly shortened hair made her look younger and more vulnerable than her 23 years. "Please sit down," Thompson said gently, gesturing to a chair across from his desk. Lieutenant Cohn took his position as translator, and Marie sat down carefully, her hands folded in her lap. "I want you to know that you are not under arrest," Thompson began. "You are under American protection, and I need to understand exactly what happened here so that I can ensure your safety and the safety of this community." Marie nodded, still finding it difficult to believe that this American general was taking such an interest in her situation. "Tell me about your relationship with Captain Mueller," Thompson said. Marie took a deep breath before beginning. "Captain Mueller was a customer at the bakery where I work. He came in regularly to buy bread for his men. At first, we only spoke about business, but gradually we began to have longer conversations." "What did you talk about?" "Many things. He told me about his home in Germany, about his family. I told him about life in the village before the war. We talked about books we had read, about places we would like to visit someday. Normal things that people talk about." "Did he ever ask you for information about resistance activities in the village?" "Never," Marie replied firmly. "And I would never have given him such information even if he had asked. I may not be a fighter like my brother, but I am French, and I love my country." "Did he give you gifts?" Marie blushed slightly. "Sometimes he brought small things, coffee or sugar that was hard to find. But he was kind of like that to other people too. I saw him give food to Madame Leclerc's children when they looked hungry. He helped old Monsieur Petit fix his cart when it broke. He wasn't cruel like some of the other soldiers." Thompson found this portrayal of Mueller interesting. Most of the villagers had described him as just another German officer, but Marie's account suggested a more complex individual. "Did you have romantic feelings for Captain Mueller?" Thompson asked directly. Marie was quiet for a long time, clearly struggling with how to answer. "I don't know," she finally said. "He was kind to me when many people in the village had begun to treat me coldly. He talked to me like I was a person worth talking to. I looked forward to our conversations because they made me feel less alone. Whether that was romantic feelings or just gratitude for kindness, I honestly don't know." Thompson appreciated her honesty. In his experience, people who were trying to hide something usually had their stories prepared in advance. Marie's uncertainty and confusion seemed genuine. "Did you ever have any physical contact with him beyond what would be normal between a shopkeeper and customer?" "No, never," Marie said immediately. "He was always proper and respectful. He never even shook my hand." After the interview, Thompson spent time reviewing his notes and considering the situation. What he had discovered was a young woman whose main crime seemed to be treating an enemy soldier with basic human decency. In the atmosphere of occupation and resistance, this had been misinterpreted as collaboration or treason. Thompson understood the villagers' anger and suspicion. They had lived under occupation for years, never knowing who they could trust, always afraid that a careless word or wrong association might bring terrible consequences. In such an environment, anyone who seemed comfortable around the enemy would naturally be viewed with suspicion. But the general also understood that war brought out both the worst and best in people, and that sometimes the best was found in unexpected places. If Marie's account was true, and his interview suggested it was, then her kindness toward a lonely enemy soldier was actually a testament to her character, not a betrayal of her country. The problem now was what to do about it. Even if Thompson concluded that Marie was innocent of collaboration, she would still have to live in a community where many people believed she was guilty. The damage to her reputation had already been done, and in a small village like Saint-Emilion, such stains were not easily washed away. That evening, Thompson walked through the village streets, observing how the liberation was progressing. American soldiers were helping to restore order and distribute supplies. French flags hung from windows, and people were beginning to venture out more freely. But he also noticed the way some villagers looked toward the bakery where Marie was being kept under protection. The anger and suspicion were still there, just temporarily suppressed by American authority. Lieutenant Cohn joined the general for his evening walk. "What are you thinking about the Du Bois situation, sir?" "I think she's innocent of anything approaching treason," Thompson replied. "But innocent or not, her life in this village is going to be very difficult. These people have decided she's guilty, and they're not likely to change their minds easily. What can we do about it?" Thompson stopped walking and looked up at the stars that were just beginning to appear in the darkening sky. "I'm not sure yet. We can't stay here forever to protect her, and we can't force people to change their minds about her. But we also can't just abandon her to mob justice." As they continued their walk, they passed the church where Father Bernard was locking up after evening prayers. The priest had been notably absent during the day's interviews, and Thompson decided to speak with him. "Father, I'd like to ask you about the situation with Mademoiselle Du Bois." Father Bernard was an elderly man who had served the village for over 30 years. He had seen the best and worst of human nature, and the war had only deepened his understanding of how good people could be led into doing terrible things. "Marie is a good young woman who has been caught up in something beyond her understanding," the priest said. "The people are angry and afraid, and they need someone to blame. She became that someone. Do you believe she collaborated with the Germans?" "I believe she treated a fellow human being with kindness, and that kindness has been twisted into something it was not," Father Bernard replied. "But the truth is less important now than what people believe to be true." "What will happen to her when we leave?" The priest sighed deeply. "That depends on how quickly people can find it in their hearts to forgive and how long their anger burns. I will do what I can to speak for her, but I am just one voice." Thompson thanked the priest and continued his walk, his mind working on the problem. By the time he returned to his headquarters, he had begun to form an idea that might offer Marie a chance for a new life, even if it meant leaving behind everything she had ever known. The next morning brought news that would change everything. A messenger arrived with orders for Thompson's unit to move north toward the German border, where the fighting was still active. They would be leaving Saint-Emilion within 48 hours. Thompson realized that his time to resolve Marie's situation was running out. Whatever he was going to do to help her, he needed to do it quickly. The idea that had been forming in his mind the night before began to take more concrete shape. He called Lieutenant Cohn into his office. "Robert, how is your French? I mean, really, how well do you speak it?" "Pretty well, sir. I lived in Paris for 2 years before the war, when my father was working at the embassy." "Good. I want you to have a conversation with Mademoiselle Du Bois. Not an official interview, just to talk. Find out about her family, her education, her skills. Find out what she wants to do with her life." Cohn looked puzzled. "May I ask why, sir?" Thompson leaned back in his chair. "I have an idea that might help her, but I need to know more about her background first. We're going to be leaving here soon, and when we do, she's going to be on her own with people who consider her a traitor. That's not a situation I'm comfortable leaving behind." Lieutenant Cohn went to speak with Marie that afternoon. He found her sitting by the window in the room above the bakery, looking out at the village she had called home her entire life. Her shortened hair had been neatly arranged by Dr. Rousseau, but she still looked fragile and uncertain. "The general asked me to speak with you," Cohn said in French. "Not about the accusations or the investigation. He wants to know about you as a person." Over the course of an hour, Cohn learned that Marie was more educated than many young women in rural France. She had completed her studies through the secondary level and was an avid reader. She spoke some English and a little German, which she had learned from books. Before the war, she had worked not only at the bakery, but also as a tutor for some of the village children. "What did you want to do with your life before the war changed everything?" Cohn asked. Marie was quiet for a moment. "I always dreamed of traveling, of seeing other places and meeting different kinds of people. I want to learn more languages, maybe work as a translator or a teacher. But those were just dreams. Girls from villages like this don't usually get chances like that. What about now? What do you want now?" "Now I just want to be safe," Marie said quietly. I want to go somewhere where people don't know about any of this, where I can start over and just be myself. That evening, Cohn reported his conversation to General Thompson. The more Thompson learned about Marie, the more convinced he became that his idea was the right one. "Sir," Cohn said after finishing his report, "may I ask what you're planning?" Thompson stood up and walked to the window that looked out over the village square where, just 2 days earlier, Marie had almost been publicly humiliated by her own neighbors. "I'm planning to give her a chance at the life she always wanted," he said. "But first, I need to make sure it's what she wants to." The general's plan was beginning to take shape, but he knew that the most important conversation was still ahead of him. Tomorrow, he would speak with Marie about a possibility that could change her entire future if she had the courage to take it. The morning of General Thompson's final day in Saint-Emilion dawned gray and overcast, matching the somber mood that had settled over the village. Word had spread that the American forces would be leaving soon, and with them would go the protection that had kept Marie safe from further harassment. The tension in the air was palpable as people whispered about what would happen once the Americans were gone. Marie sat in her small room, staring out the window at the village that no longer felt like home. She had barely slept the night before, knowing that her protected status was about to end. Dr. Rousseau had visited her early that morning to check on her condition, and his worried expression told her everything she needed to know about her prospects. "The general wants to see you," Lieutenant Cohn said as he entered her room. "He has something important to discuss with you." Marie nodded and followed him downstairs to the village hall. As they walked through the streets, she noticed how people turned away when they saw her, or how they whispered to each other as she passed. The fear and hostility were still there, just waiting for the American protection to be removed. In the village hall, General Thompson was studying a map spread across his desk when Marie was escorted in. He looked up at her with the same kind but serious expression she had come to recognize over the past few days. "Please sit down," Thompson said through Lieutenant Cohn's translation. "I want to discuss your future with you." Marie sat down carefully, her hands folded in her lap. She had no idea what the general might want to say to her, but she hoped it wasn't just a formal goodbye before he left her to face her fate alone. "I've completed my investigation," Thompson began. "I found no evidence that you committed any acts of collaboration or treason. In my judgment, you are guilty of nothing more than treating another human being with kindness during a time when such kindness was misunderstood." Marie felt a wave of relief wash over her, but it was quickly followed by anxiety. Being declared innocent by an American general was one thing, but convincing her neighbors of that innocence was quite another matter. "However," Thompson continued, "I also understand that your situation here is untenable. Even though you are innocent, the suspicions and hostility of your community make it impossible for you to continue living safely in this village." Marie nodded sadly. She had come to the same conclusion herself. Even if some people eventually came to believe in her innocence, enough would remain suspicious to make her life miserable. "I want to offer you an alternative," Thompson said, leaning forward slightly. "But it would require great courage on your part, and it would mean leaving everything familiar behind." "What kind of alternative?" Marie asked quietly. Thompson chose his words carefully. "The United States Army needs translators and interpreters, especially people who speak French, English, and German. With your education and language skills, you could be very valuable to our operations as we continue to push toward Germany." Marie looked surprised. She had never imagined that her modest language abilities might be considered valuable by anyone, let alone the American military. The position would come with American protection, American citizenship eventually, and the opportunity to start a completely new life in a place where no one knows anything about these accusations against you, Thompson continued. "But I would have to leave France?" Marie asked. "Yes, probably forever, or at least for many years. You would be giving up everything you've ever known in exchange for safety and a chance at the future you once dreamed of." Marie was quiet for a long time, processing what the general was offering her. It was more than she had ever dared to hope for, but it was also terrifying. Leaving France, leaving her brother, leaving everything familiar to go to a foreign country where she knew no one and understood little about the culture or customs. "What exactly would I be doing?" she asked. "Initially, you would work with our intelligence units, translating documents and interpreting for officers who need to communicate with French and German civilians and prisoners. Later, there might be opportunities to work with the State Department or other civilian agencies. With time and experience, you could build a career that would give you the independence and travel you once dreamed of." Thompson paused to let this information sink in before continuing. "I want to be completely honest with you about what this would mean. You would be starting over with nothing but the clothes on your back and whatever assistance we can provide. You would be alone in a foreign country, at least initially. It would not be easy. When would I have to decide?" Marie asked. "We leave tomorrow morning. If you want to come with us, you would need to be ready then." Marie felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of the decision she was being asked to make. Just a few days ago, her biggest worry had been finding enough food for the week. Now, she was being offered a chance to start an entirely new life in America. "Can I think about it until tonight?" she asked. "Of course." "But Marie," Thompson said, using her first name for the first time, "I want you to understand something. I've been a soldier for 20 years, and I've seen what happens to people who become scapegoats in situations like this. The anger against you might fade with time, but it might also get worse. Some people will never forgive you for what they believe you did, and they might find ways to make your life very difficult." After Marie left to consider the general's offer, Thompson called in Lieutenant Cohn for a private conversation. "Sir, can I ask why you're going to such lengths to help this young woman?" Cohn inquired. "I mean, I agree she's innocent, but we've encountered similar situations in other villages, and we haven't offered to relocate the accused." Thompson leaned back in his chair and was quiet for a moment before answering. "You know, Robert, I've been thinking about that myself. Part of it is that this situation seems particularly unjust. Most of the collaborators we've encountered actually did something to help the enemy. This young woman's only crime was being kind to someone she was supposed to hate." He paused and looked out the window toward the bakery where Marie worked. "But there's something else. I have a daughter about Marie's age back home in Ohio. She's got the same kind of spirit, the same curiosity about the world. If she were in Marie's situation, I would hope that someone with the power to help would do so." Cohn nodded, understanding the personal dimension of the general's decision. "There's also a practical consideration," Thompson continued. "We do genuinely need qualified translators and interpreters. The war isn't over, and we're going to be dealing with millions of displaced persons, prisoners of war, and civilian populations that speak different languages. Marie's skills could be genuinely valuable." Meanwhile, Marie had returned to her room to wrestle with the most important decision of her life. She sat by the window, looking out at the village where she had been born and raised, trying to imagine never seeing it again. Her brother Jacques arrived in the late afternoon, having been granted permission by the American guards to visit his sister. His face was haggard with worry and exhaustion. The stress of the past few days had aged him beyond his 19 years. "Marie, I heard about the general's offer," Jacques said as he sat down across from her. "What are you going to do?" "I don't know," Marie replied honestly. "Part of me wants to stay and fight to rebuild my reputation here. This is my home. These are my people. But another part of me thinks the general is right, that things will never really be the same here." Jacques took his sister's hands in his. "I feel so guilty about all of this. I should have defended you more strongly. I should have stood up to the resistance leaders when they started making accusations." "You did what you could," Marie said gently. "You were in an impossible position. If you had defended me too strongly, they would have turned against you too, and then where would we both be? But you're my sister. I should have protected you." Marie squeezed his hands. "You did protect me in the ways you could, and you're protecting me now by supporting whatever decision I make." They sat in silence for a while, both thinking about how much their lives had changed in such a short time. Before the war, they had been ordinary siblings in an ordinary village, with ordinary dreams and worries. Now they were facing decisions that would shape the rest of their lives. "What do you think I should do?" Marie asked. Jacques was quiet for a long time before answering. "I think you should go," he said finally. "I don't want you to leave, but I think you should. The general is right about what will happen here. Some people will never forgive you, even though you did nothing wrong. They need someone to blame for all their suffering during the war, and you've become that person. But what about you? What about our family's home, our memories here?" "I'll take care of the home," Jacques said, "and the memories will always be with us, no matter where we are. But, Marie, you always dreamed of seeing the world, of using your education for something bigger than this village. This might be your only chance to do that." As evening approached, Marie made one final walk through the village that had been her entire world for 23 years. She visited the church where she had been baptized and confirmed, the school where she had learned to read, and, the market square where she had played as a child. At each place, she encountered mixed reactions from the villagers. Some, like old Madame Beaumont, spoke to her kindly and expressed regret about what had happened. Others turned away or made hostile comments under their breath. A few, including Henri Leclerc, glared at her with undisguised hostility. The visit that affected her most was to the bakery where she had worked. Old Pierre Moreau was there, slowly cleaning up for the day. He had been like a father to her since her parents died, and his opinion mattered greatly. "Pierre," she said quietly as she entered the bakery, "I wanted to say goodbye." The old man looked at her with sad, tired eyes. "I heard about the American general's offer," he said. "Are you going to take it?" "I think so. I don't see how I can stay here now." Pierre nodded slowly. "I've been thinking about what happened, about the accusations against you. You know, I was here for all your conversations with that German captain. I heard most of what you talked about. And they were the conversations of two lonely people finding a little human connection in a terrible time. Nothing more, nothing less. But people see what they want to see, especially when they're angry and afraid." He moved closer to her and spoke quietly. "Marie, you have a good heart. Too good for this place right now. Maybe someday people will remember that kindness isn't collaboration, but that day isn't today. Will you think badly of me if I leave? I'll think well of you for having the courage to start over when staying would only mean suffering. And I'll think well of you for treating that German soldier like a human being, even when it costs you everything." Marie hugged the old man tightly, knowing it would be the last time. "Take care of yourself, Pierre. Take care of yourself too, child. And remember that your real home isn't a place, it's the goodness in your heart. You can carry that anywhere." That night, Marie made her decision. She packed her few belongings into a small suitcase that Jacques had brought her. She owned very little of value. A few changes of clothes, some books, a photograph of her parents, and a small silver cross that had been her mother's. She wrote a letter to be given to Dr. Rousseau, asking him to distribute her few possessions to people who might need them. She wrote another letter to be posted in the village, thanking those who had shown her kindness and forgiving those who hadn't. Early the next morning, before dawn, Marie met General Thompson and his men at their vehicles. She had said her final goodbye to Jacques the night before, both of them crying as they embraced for what might be the last time. "Are you sure about this?" Thompson asked as he helped her into the back of a military jeep. "I'm sure," Marie replied, though her voice shook slightly. "I'm ready to start over." As the convoy of American vehicles pulled away from Saint-Emilion, Marie looked back one last time at the village where she had lived her entire life. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting long shadows across the familiar streets and buildings. She thought about all the people still sleeping in those houses and wondered how many of them would even notice that she was gone. But as the village disappeared behind the hills, Marie felt something unexpected: relief. For the first time in months, she was free from the weight of suspicion and hostility that had been crushing her spirit. She was heading into the unknown, but at least the unknown didn't hate her. General Thompson, riding in the jeep ahead of her, was also thinking about the decision they had all made. He hoped he had done the right thing in offering Marie this opportunity. Only time would tell if she could build a new life in America, but he was confident that she deserved the chance to try. As the convoy moved north toward the continuing war, Marie clutched her small suitcase and looked forward rather than back. Somewhere ahead of her was a new life, a new identity, and perhaps the fulfillment of dreams she had thought were lost forever. The young woman who had almost been publicly humiliated as a collaborator was now on her way to becoming something she had never imagined possible: an American translator, interpreter, and eventually, she hoped, an American citizen. It was a transformation that would have seemed impossible just a week ago, but war had a way of making impossible things happen. Behind them, the village of Saint-Emilion continued its recovery from occupation and liberation. Some villagers would eventually come to regret how they had treated Marie Dubois. Others would maintain their conviction that she had gotten what she deserved. But none of them would ever know what became of the young woman they had driven away, or how the kindness that had once been mistaken for treason would eventually become the foundation of an entirely new life in a faraway land. 6 months had passed since Marie Dubois left Saint-Emilion with General Thompson's convoy, and her life had transformed in ways she never could have imagined. She now sat in a small office in occupied Germany, wearing the olive-drab uniform of the U.S. Army's Women's Army Corps, her once shorn hair having grown back into a neat, professional style that framed her face with quiet confidence. The work was exactly what General Thompson had promised: challenging, important, and utilizing skills she had never known she possessed. Marie had been assigned to the 7th Army's Intelligence Division, where her ability to speak French, German, and English fluently made her invaluable for interrogating prisoners of war and translating captured documents. What surprised her most was how natural the work felt. Her gentle manner and genuine curiosity about people made even hostile prisoners willing to talk to her. She had a gift for making people feel heard and understood, even in the artificial confines of an interrogation room. This same quality that had once made her suspect in the eyes of her neighbors now made her one of the most effective translators in her unit. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell, the commanding officer of Marie's division, had quickly recognized her potential. Mitchell was a career military officer who had fought hard to prove herself in a man's army, and she had a keen eye for talent in other women. "Corporal Dubois," Mitchell said one afternoon as she reviewed Marie's latest report, "your work on the Munich documents was exceptional. Have you given any thought to what you want to do after the war ends?" Marie had been promoted to corporal just 2 months after joining the unit, a recognition of both her skills and her dedication. She had thrown herself into her work with an intensity that impressed her superiors and colleagues alike. "I haven't really thought that far ahead, ma'am," Marie replied honestly. "Everything has been so new and different. I'm still learning to be an American soldier." "Well, you should start thinking about it," Mitchell said. "The State Department is going to need people with your language skills and cultural knowledge for the Reconstruction effort. There are also opportunities with the United Nations, which is just getting started. A young woman with your abilities could go far in the post-war world." The idea of working for the State Department or the United Nations seemed almost surreal to Marie. Just months ago, she had been a village baker's assistant whose biggest ambition was to someday visit Paris. Now she was being told she could have a career in international affairs. That evening, Marie sat in her small quarters writing letters. She had maintained a correspondence with her brother Jacques, who had written to tell her that life in Saint-Emilion was slowly returning to normal. The resistance members had been honored by the new French government, and Jacques himself had been decorated for his service. He was now working to rebuild the local infrastructure and had even started courting a young woman from a neighboring village. "The village is healing," Jacques wrote in his latest letter. "People are starting to remember who they were before the war made them afraid of everyone and everything. Some of them ask about you sometimes. A few have even said they think maybe they were too harsh in their judgment. But most still think you got what you deserved by leaving." Marie felt a complex mix of emotions reading these words. Part of her was relieved that her former neighbors were moving on with their lives. Another part felt a lingering sadness that they still couldn't understand that her only crime had been treating another human being with kindness. But increasingly, she found herself thinking less about the past and more about the future. America was vast and full of opportunities she was only beginning to understand. Her fellow WACs came from all over the United States, and their stories of different cities, different cultures, different possibilities fascinated her. One of her closest friends was Sergeant Betty Rodriguez from Los Angeles, a Mexican-American woman who had joined the Army to escape poverty and prove herself in a world that often dismissed her because of her ethnicity and gender. Betty had become Marie's guide to understanding American culture and customs. "You know what I love about you, Marie?" Betty said one evening as they sat in the recreation room of their base, writing letters and listening to American jazz music on the radio. "You never complain about anything. Most of us joined up because we had to, because it was our best option for a better life. But you chose to leave everything behind and start over, and you never seemed to regret it. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd stayed," Marie admitted. "Whether things would have gotten better eventually." "Maybe they would have," Betty replied. "But you would have spent years waiting to find out, and you might never have discovered what you're really capable of. Look at you now, girl. You're interrogating Nazi officers and translating secret documents. You're making a real difference in this war." It was true. Marie had been directly involved in several intelligence operations that had provided valuable information about German troop movements and supply lines. Her gentle approach to prisoner interrogation had yielded information that more aggressive tactics had failed to obtain. She was no longer just a victim of circumstances beyond her control. She had become an active participant in shaping the outcome of the war. The most profound change in Marie's life came in early 1945, when her unit was assigned to work with a group of Allied officers preparing for the occupation of Germany after the war ended. Among these officers was Captain Heinrich Müller. Marie recognized him immediately when he walked into the briefing room, despite the fact that he was now wearing an American uniform. The man who had once bought bread from her in Saint-Emilion was now working for U.S. intelligence, having surrendered to American forces and been recruited because of his knowledge of German military operations. The reunion was awkward and emotional. Müller looked genuinely shocked to see Marie, and for a moment neither of them knew what to say. "Marie," he said quietly in French when they had a chance to speak privately after the briefing, "I cannot believe you are here. What happened after the liberation? I worried about you when we had to withdraw." "It's a long story," Marie replied, also in French, though she was now equally comfortable speaking English. "Let's just say that your kindness to me caused some problems with my neighbors." Müller's face darkened with understanding. "They accuse you of collaboration because you were polite to me." "Yes, I was almost publicly humiliated before an American general intervened and offered me a chance to start over here." "I am so sorry," Müller said, his voice filled with genuine regret. "I never meant for my friendship to cause you harm. If I had known what would happen, I would have been more careful." "You have nothing to apologize for," Marie replied firmly. "You treated me with kindness and respect when others were suspicious and hostile. The kindness may have caused me problems then, but it also taught me something important about judging people as individuals rather than as representatives of groups I'm supposed to hate." Over the following weeks, Marie and Müller worked together professionally on several translation projects. Their shared history created an unusual bond, but it was different from their wartime relationship. Both had been changed by their experiences, and both had gained perspective on the events that had brought them together in Saint-Emilion. Müller had surrendered to American forces after becoming disillusioned with the Nazi cause. He had witnessed too many atrocities and had come to understand that the war he was fighting was not the noble struggle for his homeland that he had once believed it to be. His defection to the American side had provided valuable intelligence and had earned him a kind of provisional trust, though he knew he would always be viewed with some suspicion. "You know," Müller said to Marie one day, as they worked on translating German documents about prisoner of war camps, I sometimes think about our conversations in your bakery. You were one of the few people during the war who talked to me like I was a human being rather than just a uniform representing an ideology. That's what got me in trouble, Marie replied with a slight smile. Yes, but it's also what made you the person you are now. You see people as individuals, not as enemies to be hated or allies to be trusted without question. That's a rare quality, especially in wartime. Their professional relationship remained cordial, but careful. Both understood that their past had to remain in the past if they were to function effectively in their current roles. Marie was building a new life and identity as an American, while Mueller was trying to atone for his role in a war he had come to regret. As the war in Europe drew to a close in the spring of 1945, Marie faced another major decision about her future. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell had been promoted and was being transferred to Washington, D.C. to work on post-war planning. She had offered to take Marie with her as her assistant and translator. This could be the beginning of a real career in government service, Mitchell explained. The world is going to need people who understand different cultures and languages. The United Nations is being established. There will be reconstruction efforts all over Europe, and America is going to play a leading role in all of it. Marie was tempted by the opportunity, but she had also received another offer that intrigued her. A professor at Columbia University in New York had heard about her work and was offering her a scholarship to study international relations and languages. It would mean leaving the Army and starting over once again as a student, but it could open even more doors for her future. The decision was made easier by a letter she received from Jacques. He had saved enough money to visit America and wanted to see how she was doing in her new life. The idea of seeing her brother again, of showing him what she had accomplished, filled Marie with excitement. Jacques arrived in New York in June 1945, just as the war in Europe was officially ending. Marie met him at the ship dock, wearing her army uniform and speaking English to the customs officials who processed his arrival. Jacques could barely believe the transformation in his sister. "You look so different," he said in French as they embraced. "So confident and strong. You even stand differently." "I feel different," Marie replied. "I feel like I'm finally becoming the person I was meant to be." They spent a week together in New York, with Marie showing Jacques the city and introducing him to her American friends and colleagues. Jacques was amazed by the size and energy of the city, by the diversity of people, by the sense of possibility that seemed to permeate everything. "I understand now why you chose to come here," Jacques told her on his last evening in America. "There's something in this place that brings out the best in people, that makes them believe they can become more than they were." "Are you happy with my decision?" Marie asked. "I'm proud of you," Jacques replied. "You took the worst moment of your life and turned it into the beginning of something wonderful. Not many people have that kind of courage." On the day Jacques left to return to France, Marie made her final decision about her future. She would leave the army and accept the scholarship to Columbia University. She would study international relations and continue developing her language skills. She would prepare herself for a career in diplomacy or international service. As she watched Jacques' ship disappear over the horizon, Marie reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The young woman who had been dragged to a chair in the village square to have her head shaved in shame had become Corporal Marie Du Bois of the United States Army, a value translator and intelligence analyst who was about to become a university student preparing for a career in international affairs. The transformation was so complete that sometimes she felt like she was living someone else's life. But it was her life, a life she had chosen and built through determination, hard work, and the kindness of people like General Thompson, who had believed in her potential when she couldn't see it herself. Years later, Dr. Marie Du Bois Thompson. She had taken the general's surname when he and his wife formally adopted her after the war, would become one of the first female diplomats in the United States Foreign Service. She would work in embassies around the world, using her gift for languages and her understanding of human nature to help resolve conflicts and build bridges between nations. She would marry a fellow diplomat and have 2 children whom she would raise to understand that kindness and understanding were not weaknesses but strengths that could change the world. She would never return to St. Emilion, but she would never forget the lesson she learned there about the power of both hatred and love to transform lives. And sometimes when she encountered people who had been victims of prejudice or mob justice, she would think about a German captain who had treated her with kindness when kindness was dangerous, and an American general who had stepped in to stop an injustice when he could have simply looked the other way. She would remember that individual acts of courage and compassion could change the trajectory of a person's entire life. The girl whose head was almost shaved to humiliate her had become a woman whose mind and heart would touch thousands of lives across the globe. It was a transformation that began with the worst of human nature, but was completed through the best of it, proving that sometimes the darkest moments in life are simply the prelude to the brightest chapters yet to be written. In her later years, when people asked Marie about the secret to her success, she would often think about that moment in the village square when General Thompson stepped forward to defend her. She would remember the importance of speaking up for those who cannot speak for themselves, and the power of offering someone a second chance when their first chance has been taken away by circumstances beyond their control. Everyone deserves the opportunity to start over, she would say. The question is whether we have the courage to take that opportunity when it's offered, and whether we have the wisdom to offer it to others when we have the power to do so. It was a lesson learned in the hardest possible way, but one that would guide her through a life of service, purpose, and ultimately the kind of happiness that comes from turning personal suffering into a force for good in the world.